Let's speak now to the writer and broadcaster Jonathan Sacerdoti, who writes for The Spectator and The Jewish Chronicle. Jonathan, good morning to you. Welcome to BBC News. We were just hearing from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying we have gone to great lengths to prevent civilian casualties. He says we hope we can restore quiet. But on the 10th day of violence, what are your hopes that quiet can be restored?
I think if we listened to Benjamin Netanyahu there, we understood clearly what Israel's aims are. He says that they hope they can restore quiet, but as far as Israel's concerned, they see this as a legitimate response to thousands of rockets having been launched out of the Gaza Strip towards Israeli civilians. And as you said, they've actually managed to kill quite a few this time, despite the Iron Dome defense system that Israel really put quite a lot of money and research into developing. Quite a unique system that does stop over 90% of those rockets, but of course it can't catch them all. And on the other side, you see Israel's military actions in Gaza, of course, wreaking havoc in some of the areas there, including civilian areas, because Israel says Hamas puts its facilities and its infrastructure directly underneath or embedded in those civilian areas. And obviously, that has catastrophic results when civilians are caught up in that fighting, something Netanyahu said Israel is very keen to avoid by all sorts of unusual means, like giving warnings and the like for people to evacuate those buildings before strikes. But inevitably, there will be people who get caught up in that.
A little earlier, and I don't know if you were able to hear, we were speaking to former spokesperson and Director of Advocacy and Communications for the UN, that's Chris Guinness, and he was highlighting that we have been here before, we have heard of talks, we've heard of cessation of violence, we've heard of ceasefires, and yet here we are once again. And it raises that question of why there cannot be a political solution to this rather than just the military response that we see time and time again.
Well, absolutely. This is something that we have seen before, unfortunately. And I think it's virtually impossible for there to be a political resolution to the conflict between Hamas and Israel when Hamas has embedded in its founding charter the idea that Israel needs to be destroyed. In fact, that all Jews need to be destroyed. So obviously, if you give people the choice of, we want to destroy all Jews, the other side says we don't, there's not really a compromise area for that. And I think that that's part of the problem is Hamas, despite the blockade of Gaza, despite the very tight regulations from both Israel and Egypt for any goods to get in there, we can see now has managed to amass thousands of rockets, which they're launching indiscriminately on Israeli civilian areas. And that means that there's obviously quite a porous border. Those weapons are often coming from Iran, or the expertise on how to build the weapons internally in Gaza are coming from Iran. And while there's a terrorist group like Hamas, which is really intent on destroying Israel and Israeli civilians, developing these weapons and plowing the resources of Gaza not into the welfare of the people that live there, but instead into this sort of weaponry and digging underground tunnel networks under civilian areas, then it seems very difficult to imagine how Israel can feel that it's secure enough that it doesn't undertake these sorts of retaliations when it is attacked with thousands of rockets.
US President Joe Biden voicing his support for a ceasefire, but then at the same time, the US has blocked the UN Security Council statement that calls for that cessation of violence. How do you account for that very different approach from the United States?
Indeed, I think there were those who wondered how Joe Biden might be different from his predecessor in dealing with Israel and the Palestinians. Remember, of course, Donald Trump managed to bring about in the Middle East some unusual normalization deals between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. Joe Biden, though, is standing firm and saying that he believes that Israel has the right to self-defense, but finally has come out and said that he would like them to push towards a ceasefire. Israel, for its part, says it's not hurrying towards a ceasefire while there's work to be done in debilitating Hamas, not only so that it will stop these attacks, which are ongoing, but so that it won't be able to launch them again in the future and restock and rebuild quite so quickly. So at least there'll be a longer gap before the next one of these engagements. I think the reason Biden has said this now and has taken a bit of time is he realizes that there is the need for Israel to protect its civilian population. And much as it doesn't play out well on news channels and in the news, watching war is extremely ugly. There is perhaps a realization that some of this is inevitable, and Israel does, he feels, have the right to defend itself. But calling for that ceasefire now indicates that we're moving towards the end of this military operation, and that Israel perhaps in the next few days will say that there has been some result from the secret talks that are probably ongoing at the moment, using Egypt as an intermediary to come to a ceasefire agreement. And perhaps this is the first sign that Joe Biden has said that he would like Israel to push towards that ceasefire, notably, though, not using the word immediate, showing again that he still has that ongoing support of Israel's right to undertake these military actions. Of course, that doesn't help Gazan civilians who are caught up in all of this, many of them dying, many of them being injured, many of them having their lives ruined because of the Hamas infrastructure that is buried deep within their civilian areas and even underneath their homes.
What are the longer term implications of this violence? And I'm talking particularly about the violence between neighbouring Israeli Arabs and Jews that we've seen for the first time really come to a head in a way that perhaps it hasn't done before.
Well, that is a very sad and depressing part of the story for Israelis internally. And I think that one of the effects that might have is to undo some of the good work that has been going on between Israeli Arabs and Jews living in Israel. Remember that they do coexist and get on fairly well within the state of Israel. And this now puts doubt in the minds of some Israeli Jews, I suppose, who wonder when these attacks might happen, who wonder if some of their Arab neighbors might be able to do this sort of thing. And that's grossly unfair, because the vast majority of Israeli Arabs live in peace and coexist very happily with their Jewish neighbors there. Of course, there are some complications, injustices, imbalances within Israeli society, as there often are in societies where there's an ethnic minority that feels they suffer from some forms of discrimination. But within Israel, generally speaking, it has until now been relatively peaceful and calm. And it continues to be, I must add, between most people. These are the fringes who are carrying out this sort of unrest within Israel. Politically speaking, it's interesting because an Arab party with Islamist tendencies had actually done much better than had been expected in the last elections and had looked likely to hold the key to forming a coalition government. Whichever side was able to form a coalition may have relied on that Arab party. Perhaps this unrest will have put paid to that. And of course, there were already talks about what the coalition government could look like, bearing in mind there's been this sort of unrest. To have that Arab party, which has, as I said, Islamist tendencies, included in any coalition might be impossible now for any of the more traditional Israeli parties to countenance.
Jonathan, it is good to talk to you this morning. Thanks for your time. Jonathan Sacerdoti there with the latest on the ongoing violence between Israeli forces and Hamas. We will stay right across that story more for you here on BBC News as we get it.